Picture this. You're a palace guard in ancient Rome, year 54 AD, and you've just witnessed something that makes your blood run cold. The most powerful woman in the empire, Agrippina the Younger, is moving through the dimly lit corridors of the Palatine Hill with predatory grace, heading toward her teenage son's chambers. But the way she walks, the silk gown clinging to her curves, the heavy perfume trailing behind her like a weapon, this isn't a mother going to wish her child good night. The guards stationed outside young Nero's door step aside without question, their eyes carefully averted, because everyone in the palace knows what happens when the Empress Mother makes these midnight visits. And what you're about to witness represents one of the most twisted examples of maternal manipulation and sexual abuse in recorded history. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of Roman excess. It's the story of how a woman's desperate hunger for power transformed maternal love into predatory obsession, how political ambition corrupted the most sacred bond between mother and child, and how a teenage boy was systematically groomed and abused by the one person who should have protected him above all others. The name Agrippina might not be familiar to you, but her manipulation tactics would make modern psychologists shudder. Let's start with the woman who would become the architect of imperial Rome's most disturbing family tragedy. Agrippina the Younger wasn't born evil, she was forged by it. Growing up in the bloodthirsty world of Julio-Claudian politics, where family members routinely murdered each other for power, she learned early that survival meant wielding every weapon at her disposal, including her own body. By the time she was 30, she had already buried 2 husbands under suspicious circumstances, accumulated more wealth than most senators, and developed a reputation for ruthless intelligence that terrified even hardened Roman politicians. But absolute ambition has a way of corrupting even the most fundamental human instincts, and by 49 AD, something had fundamentally broken inside Agrippina's maternal psyche. Maybe it was the constant paranoia that comes with knowing your own family wants you dead. Maybe it was the isolation of being the only woman in an empire of 60 million who could challenge emperors for power. Or maybe it was what happened when she looked at her 11-year-old son, Nero, and realized he represented the ultimate weapon in her arsenal for controlling Rome itself. Her son wasn't just any child. He was direct descendant of Augustus, carrying the bloodline that could legitimize any claim to imperial power. When Agrippina first conceived her plan to use Nero as her pathway to absolute control, she began studying him with the calculating precision of a military strategist. The boy was intelligent, artistic, and most importantly, completely dependent on her approval and affection. What started as normal maternal influence quickly evolved into something much more sinister and psychologically devastating. Ancient historians describe Agrippina's behavior during this period as increasingly possessive and inappropriate. She would insist on bathing with Nero long past the age when such intimacy was considered normal, claiming it was necessary for his health and cleanliness. Palace servants reported seeing her examining his developing body with an intensity that made them uncomfortable, touching him in ways that seemed more medical than maternal. But perhaps most tellingly, she began reshaping her relationship with Nero to eliminate any emotional distance between them. Where other aristocratic Roman children were raised by wet nurses and tutors, Agrippina insisted on personally overseeing every aspect of Nero's education and daily routine. She positioned herself not just as his mother, but as his closest confidant, his primary source of affection, and eventually his only meaningful relationship with another human being. This wasn't maternal devotion. It was systematic isolation, designed to make Nero completely psychologically dependent on her attention and approval. She carefully controlled which other adults had access to him, surrounding him with people who owed their positions entirely to her favor. She monitored his friendships with other children, discouraging any relationships that might compete with her influence over his emotional development. Ancient sources tell us that Agrippina would sometimes spend hours simply watching Nero as he went about his studies or play, not to ensure his safety, but to study his reactions and emotional responses. She was learning to read him like a musical instrument, understanding exactly which psychological buttons to press to get the responses she wanted. This wasn't love. It was the behavior of someone who had confused maternal affection with ownership, who saw her own child not as an independent person, but as a beautiful, impressionable tool that existed solely for her political advancement. Nero, for his part, seemed to initially thrive under this intense maternal attention. Unlike other Roman children who were raised with stern discipline and emotional distance, he enjoyed unprecedented affection and indulgence from the most powerful woman in the empire. But children can't distinguish between healthy love and manipulative attention, and what Agrippina was providing was a sophisticated form of psychological conditioning that would leave lasting damage. She began using her influence to advance her family's interests while simultaneously building Nero's dependence on her approval. When he pleased her with his studies or behavior, she would reward him with elaborate gifts, special privileges, and most importantly, physical affection that was becoming increasingly inappropriate for a mother and her growing son. When he disappointed her, she would withdraw all warmth and attention, leaving him desperate to regain her favor through any means necessary. The details of what happened when Agrippina married her uncle, Emperor Claudius, in 49 AD vary depending on which ancient historian you believe, but the outcome was always the same. She now had direct access to imperial power, and Nero became her weapon for consolidating that control. The wedding itself was controversial. Marriages between uncles and nieces required special senatorial permission, but Agrippina had spent years building the political coalition necessary to make it happen. What made this marriage particularly disturbing wasn't just the family connection, but how Agrippina immediately began positioning 12-year-old Nero as Claudius's heir, despite the emperor having his own biological son, Britannicus. According to Tacitus, Agrippina's strategy involved a carefully orchestrated campaign to make Claudius prefer her son over his own child, using a combination of political maneuvering and what contemporary sources describe as inappropriate intimacies involving the young prince. Imagine the moment when Nero realized that his mother's affection came with expectations that no child should ever face. The woman who had been his primary source of love and security was now asking him to participate in political schemes that required him to charm and manipulate the most powerful man in the world. But by this point, Nero was so psychologically dependent on Agrippina's approval that refusing her requests seemed impossible. Ancient sources describe the scene that followed Agrippina's marriage to Claudius as one of the most calculated examples of child manipulation in imperial history. She reportedly began coaching Nero on how to interact with his new stepfather, teaching him which gestures, expressions, and words would be most effective in winning Claudius's favor. These weren't normal instructions about respectful behavior. They were sophisticated lessons in seduction and psychological manipulation. The palace became a stage where a 13-year-old boy was required to perform elaborate emotional deceptions to advance his mother's political agenda. Courtiers reported that Nero developed an almost supernatural ability to mirror Claudius's moods and interests, becoming whatever version of himself the emperor seemed to prefer at any given moment. But they also noted that he grew increasingly anxious and withdrawn when not actively performing these roles, as if his authentic personality was being systematically erased. What happened next has been debated by historians for centuries, but the consensus is that Agrippina began using her son's developing sexuality as a tool for maintaining control over both Nero and Claudius. When Nero began showing normal adolescent interest in girls his own age, Agrippina didn't encourage these healthy attractions. Instead, she became intensely jealous of any attention he paid to other females, treating teenage romantic interests as threats to her exclusive influence over his emotional life. Multiple ancient sources suggest that Agrippina deliberately sabotaged Nero's normal sexual development, using a combination of psychological manipulation and inappropriate physical intimacy to ensure that she remained the primary female figure in his life. Palace servants described walking in on scenes that left them deeply uncomfortable. The emperor's wife and her teenage son in embraces that lasted too long, conversations conducted in whispers while sitting closer than appropriate, and what one source describes as caresses that belonged more to lovers than family. The psychological pressure on Nero intensified as Agrippina's behavior became more controlling and invasive. She began demanding detailed reports about his daily activities, requiring him to account for every conversation and interaction. Anyone who spent significant time with Nero was expected to report back to Agrippina about his moods, comments, and apparent loyalties. The teenager found himself living under constant surveillance by the person who claimed to love him most. But perhaps most damaging was Agrippina's systematic destruction of Nero's ability to form normal relationships with anyone else. She carefully positioned herself as not just his mother, but as his political advisor, his confidant, his source of sexual education, and eventually his primary romantic attachment. By the time Nero was 14, multiple sources suggest that the boundaries between maternal love and romantic obsession had been completely erased. Contemporary medical records, hidden away in various archives for centuries, provide disturbing glimpses into what palace physicians observed during this period. One doctor wrote, "The young prince exhibits signs of considerable confusion regarding appropriate relationships between family members. His attachment to his mother appears to have developed characteristics more typically observed between lovers than relatives." Another was more direct. "The Empress Mother's influence over her son has created psychological patterns that may prove impossible to correct in adulthood." The turning point came in 54 AD when Emperor Claudius died under mysterious circumstances that strongly suggested poisoning. Historians have debated for centuries whether Agrippina murdered her husband, but what's certain is that his death positioned 15-year-old Nero as Emperor of Rome, with his mother as the power behind the throne. What followed was perhaps even more disturbing than what had come before. Instead of stepping back now that her political goals had been achieved, Agrippina doubled down on her psychological control over Nero. She moved into quarters adjacent to his in the palace, installed herself in meetings with government officials, and began appearing on official currency alongside her son, unprecedented behavior for an emperor's mother. But most significantly, she continued the inappropriate physical and emotional intimacy that had characterized their relationship throughout his adolescence. The Roman court, already shocked by Agrippina's political maneuvering, now had to navigate an even more treacherous landscape. Courtiers were expected to treat a teenage emperor and his manipulative mother as if their obviously unhealthy relationship was normal imperial protocol. Senators had to pretend not to notice when Agrippina would position herself physically between Nero and other officials during meetings, or when she would whisper instructions in his ear during important negotiations. Foreign diplomats reported back to their governments about the disturbing dynamics they observed in the Roman court. One ambassador wrote, "The young emperor appears unable to make any significant decision without consulting his mother privately. More concerning is the physical intimacy they display in public, behavior that would be scandalous between unrelated adults, but becomes deeply troubling when observed between a mother and her teenage son." For Nero, every day became a high-stakes performance where the slightest deviation from his mother's expectations could result in emotional punishment designed to break his will. Agrippina had perfected the art of psychological abuse, alternating between overwhelming affection and devastating withdrawal in ways that kept Nero constantly off balance and desperate for her approval. Ancient sources describe Nero during this period as becoming increasingly skilled at reading his mother's moods and responding appropriately, but they also note that he developed nervous habits and signs of chronic anxiety. He would twitch when Agrippina entered rooms unexpectedly, stutter when forced to disagree with her in public, and show signs of panic when separated from her for extended periods. The psychological strain is almost impossible to imagine. Every morning, Nero woke as the most powerful person in the known world, commanding 30 legions and governing 60 million people. But in private, he remained a frightened teenager who had never learned to exist independently of his mother's overwhelming presence. Every decision required her approval, every relationship needed her permission, and every moment of happiness depended on maintaining her favor. But by 55 AD, something began to shift in the dynamic between mother and son. As Nero matured into his late teens, he started showing signs of rebellion against Agrippina's total control over his life. These weren't normal teenage assertions of independence. They were the desperate attempts of a psychologically damaged young man to establish some sense of autonomous identity. The first major conflict came when Nero expressed interest in Poppaea Sabina, a beautiful and intelligent woman who represented everything that Agrippina was not. Where his mother was controlling and manipulative, Poppaea was charming and supportive. Where Agrippina demanded constant attention and validation, Poppaea offered genuine affection without strings attached. Most dangerously from Agrippina's perspective, Poppaea encouraged Nero to make decisions independently, rather than constantly seeking maternal approval. Agrippina's reaction to this threat revealed the full extent of her psychological manipulation. Rather than accepting her son's normal desire for romantic companionship, she launched a vicious campaign to destroy his relationship with Poppaea. She spread rumors about the woman's character, used her political influence to create obstacles to their meetings, and most significantly, began intensifying her own inappropriate intimacy with Nero as a way of reclaiming his exclusive attention. What followed was a psychological war between two women for control over a young man's sexuality and emotional loyalty, with Nero trapped in the middle as both weapon and prize. Ancient historians describe this period as one of the most toxic and manipulative in imperial history, as Agrippina employed every tool of emotional abuse she had perfected over years of conditioning to maintain her hold over her son. The competition reached its climax when Agrippina made what several sources describe as her most desperate and disturbing gambit. Recognizing that she was losing influence over Nero to a younger, more attractive rival, she allegedly attempted to seduce her own son directly, crossing the final boundary between maternal manipulation and incestuous abuse. According to Tacitus, the incident occurred during one of their private meetings, when Agrippina appeared in Nero's chambers wearing clothing designed more for a lover than a mother. Contemporary sources describe her behavior as abandoning all pretense of maternal propriety and attempting to claim her son's body as she had claimed his mind. The exact details vary between historians, but the consensus is that Agrippina made explicit sexual advances toward Nero, positioning this ultimate violation as both punishment for his disloyalty and proof of her exclusive right to his affection. Nero's reaction to this final assault on his psychological boundaries was immediate and devastating. For the first time in his life, he was confronted with the full reality of what his mother had been doing to him throughout his childhood and adolescence. The woman who had claimed to love him more than anyone else had actually been systematically grooming and abusing him for her own political and psychological gratification. The psychological revelation was shattering. In that moment, Nero understood that every embrace, every private conversation, every gesture of maternal affection had been calculated manipulation designed to serve Agrippina's agenda rather than his well-being. The love he had desperately craved and worked to maintain was actually a sophisticated form of abuse that had stolen his childhood, warped his sexuality, and left him psychologically crippled. But the damage was too extensive for simple rejection to heal. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight, and Nero found himself caught between revulsion at his mother's behavior and desperate need for the only source of affection he had ever known. Ancient sources describe him during this period as alternately trying to establish distance from Agrippina and then panicking when that distance made him feel abandoned and alone. The court watched in fascination and horror as the most powerful mother and son in the world engaged in an increasingly public psychological battle. Agrippina, recognizing that her sexual gambit had backfired, began using more traditional forms of manipulation, threats of political exposure, reminders of his dependence on her expertise, and most effectively, emotional blackmail about the sacrifices she had made for his success. She would remind him of the husbands she had buried, the enemies she had eliminated, the political battles she had fought, all supposedly for his benefit. She portrayed herself as a devoted mother whose only crime was loving her son too much, while positioning his attempts at independence as ingratitude and betrayal of family bonds. These guilt-based manipulations proved almost as effective as her previous tactics because they played on the psychological conditioning she had established throughout his childhood. For Nero, every interaction with his mother became a minefield of competing emotions. Revulsion at her manipulative behavior mixed with genuine fear of losing her support, anger at years of abuse combined with desperate need for maternal approval. The teenager who ruled an empire found himself psychologically paralyzed by a relationship that had defined his entire sense of identity. The situation reached a breaking point in 59 AD when Agrippina made what would prove to be her final miscalculation. Frustrated by Nero's increasing resistance to her control and his growing relationship with Poppaea, she threatened to reveal embarrassing details about their inappropriate relationship to the Roman Senate. In her mind, this was the ultimate weapon, the threat of public humiliation that would force Nero back into complete submission. But Agrippina had underestimated how thoroughly her years of abuse had damaged her son's psychology. Instead of submitting to this final act of blackmail, Nero experienced what modern psychiatrists would recognize as a complete psychological break. The young man, who had spent his entire life desperately seeking his mother's approval, suddenly realized that she would never stop using that need to control and exploit him. What happened next represents one of the most calculated acts of matricide in human history. Nero didn't just decide to kill Agrippina in a moment of rage. He planned her murder with the same cold precision she had used to manipulate him throughout his childhood. The emperor consulted with engineers to design a boat that would collapse and drown her, making her death appear accidental. The assassination attempt took place on the Bay of Naples, where Nero had invited his mother for what appeared to be a reconciliation dinner. After an evening of apparent family harmony, Agrippina was escorted to a specially constructed vessel that was designed to break apart once it reached deep water. But even in this final gambit, she proved more resilient than her son had anticipated. When the boat collapsed as planned, Agrippina survived the initial wreck and managed to swim toward shore. Recognizing that this was no accident, she understood that her own son had finally turned the weapons she had taught him against their creator. But rather than feeling betrayed, contemporary sources suggest that she felt a twisted sense of pride at seeing Nero demonstrate the ruthless intelligence she had cultivated in him. The soldiers who found Agrippina struggling in the water received orders to finish what the sabotaged boat had failed to accomplish. As they approached with drawn swords, she reportedly pointed to her womb and said, "Strike here, for this bore Nero." Even in her final moments, she was attempting to manipulate the situation, using maternal guilt as a weapon against the men who had come to kill her. Her death marked the end of one of history's most toxic family relationships, but it couldn't undo the psychological damage that years of systematic abuse had inflicted on both mother and son. Nero had finally escaped Agrippina's direct control, but the patterns of thinking and behavior she had instilled in him would continue to shape his actions for the remainder of his life. In the aftermath of his mother's murder, Nero's behavior became even more erratic and destructive. Without Agrippina's manipulative guidance, he was psychologically rudderless, alternating between grandiose displays of power and desperate attempts to find new sources of the unconditional devotion he had lost. His subsequent marriages, his artistic pursuits, his increasingly brutal treatment of anyone who opposed him, all bore the hallmarks of someone whose fundamental capacity for healthy relationships had been destroyed in childhood. The Roman people, initially grateful to be free from Agrippina's behind-the-scenes influence, gradually began to understand that their emperor's psychological damage made him potentially even more dangerous than his manipulative mother had been. A ruler who had never learned to distinguish between love and abuse, between loyalty and exploitation, between power and domination, represented a threat to the stability of the entire empire. Perhaps most tragically, we know that Nero spent his remaining years desperately trying to recreate the intense emotional connection he had experienced with Agrippina, but without her manipulative expertise to guide these attempts. His relationships with subsequent women were marked by the same possessiveness, jealousy, and inappropriate intimacy that had characterized his bond with his mother. He had learned to associate love with control, affection with manipulation, and devotion with psychological abuse. The story of Agrippina and Nero serves as a devastating reminder of how parental manipulation can destroy a child's fundamental capacity for healthy relationships. What started as a mother's political ambition ended up creating one of history's most psychologically damaged rulers, whose personal dysfunction would eventually contribute to the downfall of the Julio-Claudian dynasty itself. But ancient historians seemed less interested in Nero as a victim of systematic childhood abuse than as a symbol of imperial corruption and moral decay. What makes their story so haunting isn't just the political intrigue or the ultimate violence, but how it illustrates the way that parental manipulation can rob a child of the ability to form authentic emotional connections throughout their entire adult life. The palace that had witnessed years of psychological abuse continued to house emperors and their families, but the ghosts of this particular family's dysfunction seemed to linger in its marble halls. Subsequent rulers would struggle with their own family relationships, as if the toxicity that had consumed Agrippina and Nero had poisoned the very concept of imperial family bonds. Perhaps most disturbing is how this ancient story resonates with modern understanding of psychological abuse and childhood trauma. The techniques that Agrippina used to control and manipulate her son, isolation from other relationships, inappropriate physical intimacy, emotional blackmail, alternating between overwhelming affection and cold withdrawal, are recognized today as classic patterns of parental abuse that can cause lifelong psychological damage. The woman who claimed to love her son more than life itself actually destroyed his capacity for genuine love, replacing it with a twisted understanding of relationships based on power, control, and manipulation. In trying to make Nero completely dependent on her, she created a human being who was incapable of independence, authentic emotion, or healthy connections with others. In choosing to murder his mother, Nero reclaimed the one thing that had been denied him throughout his childhood, the power to make his own decisions about the most important relationship in his life. But by the time he was able to exercise that power, the psychological damage was too extensive to heal. The boy, who had been systematically groomed and abused by his own mother, grew up to become a man who repeated those same patterns of manipulation and abuse with everyone around him. The story reminds us that behind every historical narrative of political intrigue and imperial power, there are individual human stories of childhood trauma and survival that deserve our attention and understanding. Even across the vast gulf of 2,000 years, we can recognize the familiar patterns of parental abuse and the devastating consequences it has for both victims and society as a whole. The silk sheets that once covered the beds where inappropriate intimacies occurred between mother and son eventually covered a empire that would never fully recover from the psychological damage inflicted on its most powerful family. The marble halls that echoed with whispered manipulations and desperate pleas for affection became monuments to the human cost of treating children as weapons in adult power games. Agrippina and Nero's story ended as it had begun, with violence, manipulation, and the destruction of the most fundamental bonds between parent and child. The mother who had sacrificed her son's psychological health for political power ultimately lost everything, including her life, to the monster she had created. The son who had killed to escape maternal abuse spent his remaining years desperately seeking the unconditional love he had never actually received, but had been conditioned to believe existed. Their twisted relationship stands as one of history's most extreme examples of how parental manipulation can poison not just individual lives, but entire civilizations. The Roman Empire would eventually fall, but the psychological patterns established in one palace bedroom between a manipulative mother and her damaged son would echo through centuries of dysfunctional imperial families, reminding us that some wounds cut so deep they never heal, and some forms of love are actually sophisticated forms of abuse that destroy everything they claim to cherish.